we will go ahead and get started. Today's session is hosted by VP3 and RMI, and we've brought everyone together with the goal of introducing VP3 and virtual power plants, cooperatives and utilities. We'd like you to hear about virtual power plant opportunities and challenges from other cooperative leaders. And we're expecting that you'll leave having learned about the benefits and considerations for new and existing federal funding opportunities that can advance VPPs. So what you can expect for the agenda is we'll have a welcome. After that, we'll have presentations. We have presentations about what are VPPs. Our guest speakers will share about their implementation stories and then leveraging federal funding for VPPs. And then we'll have an overall Q&A before we go into the second part of our session today, which will be discussion and breakouts happening at the same time. VP3 members and co-ops will go into facilitated workshop breakouts. And at the same time, all the other attendees will be in a Q&A about VP3 and RMI's work supporting IRA implementation. So some Zoom norms or meeting norms for today. You've entered, we have everyone muted during the presentations and the part 1 Q&A, but we encourage a lively chat window. So please, if you have questions, put them in the chat. The intention for today is thoughtful dialogue and clarifying questions, an educational session. We hope that you will make connections with each other and the experts in the room. But a reminder that this is not a forum for exchanging confidential commercial information. With that, we are ready to turn it over to Kevin Brem, RMI manager, for an introduction to VP3.
Hey, good morning. I'm Kevin Brem, manager for VP3. I am the real Kevin Brem that I'm aware of. If you scroll through, you might see several Kevin Brems are listed. On the agenda, I realized that I shouldn't have shared my specifically tailored link, but have a flip. And if you see that your name is listed as Kevin Brem, and you are Kevin Brem, nice to meet you. If you aren't Kevin Brem, please click on, if you sort of hover over your icon and you see 3 little dots pop up, click on those 3 dots and please change your name to your actual name, and also, if possible, add a comma in your organization so we know who's in the room. So again, thanks for joining us. I wanted to just share some brief introductory remarks to set the stage for this meeting and to set the stage for sort of how you can expect to show up and who's in the room. So first, I wanted to introduce VP3, the Virtual Power Plant Partnership. VP3 is a group of nonprofit industry voices focused on growing the market for virtual power plants. It's hosted here at RMI, and our members represent leading technology and service providers in the virtual power plant space. We as RMI believe that virtual power plants are a key element of the energy transition. We'll talk a little bit later about some of the benefits we see coming from it. And we also believe that while there's great innovation taking place from technology and service providers on the utility front, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. We need to get the policies right, we need to get the regulation right, and we need the right programs in place in order for VPPs to grow. So currently we're working with our members around 4 working group areas that represent some of the span of the topics that we're looking at. This includes regulatory and policy, data, communications, and interoperability as the second group. Third is about communicating VPPs, communicating the VPP story, and the fourth is about working with utilities. So As VP3, we work with our members to figure out ways that we can advance working with advanced VPPs. And when we had our first workshop with our members, one theme that came up is, number one, we're really interested and motivated to find ways that we can engage and accelerate the work of leading utilities. And the second is that there was a lot of keen interest in finding ways, in particular, to work with electric cooperatives. So why were our members interested in working with electric cooperatives? First, I think there's recognition that co-ops have been leaders in virtual power plants. Oftentimes that leadership took place under different programs, under different names. I recently learned that all the way back in 1979, New Hampshire Electric Cooperative had an interruptible hot water program, which may have been some of the seeds of what has eventually become VPPs. Beyond that time, co-ops have continued to lead around hot water heaters, demand response, and increasingly more sophisticated forms of VPPs that we'll hear about from our co-op presenters today. Second reason co-ops are interested in working, or our members were interested in engaging co-ops, is co-ops are nimble. They're able to embrace innovation. Oftentimes they have more thin regulation and they're primarily responsible to their boards. And also there's a keen focus on members and who's at the end of the line and how to benefit them. So that's a little bit about VP3 and why our members were interested in having a session with co-ops. I also wanted to name and mention that this session is a little bit of a partnership between two initiatives within RMI. One is VP3. The other is our work supporting co-ops and supporting new era implementation, as well as implementation of other federal programs through our eLab Accelerator work. So why are we particularly motivated to support, as RMI, support co-ops? I think this comes from a couple of things. Number one is the recognition that rural America has a critical role to play in ensuring a swift and equitable energy transition. Rural America and communities in rural America are going to have an outsized responsibility for siting, permitting, supporting the construction of the energy infrastructure that we rely on. Rural America has played an outsized part in supporting our energy economy for decades and centuries when it comes to extraction of fossil fuel to support our power system. Rural America plays a critical role, and as we all know, co-ops play a critical role in rural America. Co-ops serve 56% of the US landmass and also 92% of persistent poverty counties. So if we're thinking about an equitable energy transition, it's clear that co-ops need to be a critical part of the conversation. Finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about who's in the room, just to recognize. I think you can scroll through and see some of the names and some of the organizations that we have here. First, we have rural electric cooperatives. This includes the distribution cooperatives, the generation and transmission cooperatives, as well as the cooperative organizations that support co-ops, such as NRECA, CFC, and other organizations. Second, I want to recognize VP3 members. VP3 members are leading technology and service providers. Their support of VP3 makes work like this possible. Second, I also wanted to recognize that beyond co-ops and VP3 members, there is a wide variety of organizations that signed up and expressed interest in this group, in this workshop. Thank you for joining us. Among the attendees that registered for this workshop were NGOs, not-for-profits, utilities that are not co-ops, such as investor-owned utilities, municipal utilities, regulators, and other technology and service providers. Thank you for joining us. We're glad that you were able to join us if you're in that group that I spoke of at the end. And at the end of this session today, you'll have an opportunity to learn a little bit more about the work that we do as VP3 and the work we do at RMI supporting federal implementation of federal policies, and specifically supporting making sure utilities, states, and others are utilizing the funding that's available to them. So finally, to get the most out of this session, it's intended to be interactive. We're going to share a lot of information on the front end. I know there's a lot of expertise in this room, so I encourage you to use the chat function to share links, ideas, related topics, and also later when we have a chance for question and answer to share as part of that. So once again, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Mary now, who's going to talk a little bit more, setting the stage about what do we mean by virtual power plants specifically. After that, we're going to go to co-ops who are going to share a little bit more about their specific experience.
Thank you, Kevin, and I want to extend a welcome to everyone on the line as well. My name is Mary Tobin, and I'm an associate on the carbon-free electricity team at RMI, and I support the Virtual Power Plant Partnership. I look forward to sharing an overview of what are VPPs and how they can help cooperatives. So on the next slide, we wanted to begin by providing a definition of what are virtual power plants to ground the conversation today. How VP3 defines a virtual power plant is an aggregation of grid-integrated distributed energy resources. To break down the three parts of that definition, distributed energy resources can include electric vehicles, batteries, heat pumps, thermostats, controls as a whole building. And we keep this definition large, understanding that there are a bunch of different technologies that can work together as a VPP, and we want to be inclusive in our definition. The second part is working together as an aggregation. So this allows the individual contribution from one resource to be multiplied and often controlled as from a grid operator. And lastly, to be grid interactive. This allows the combined power of these distributed energy resources that can deliver load balancing and provide utility scale grid services like a traditional power plant would provide. On the next slide, we wanted to share 6 benefits on how VPPs are already providing value to households, businesses, and society. Last year, RMI published an insight brief titled Virtual Power Plants, Real Benefits that highlighted these 6 benefits. To go through them briefly, first, we have reliability. And from our analysis, we showed that virtual power plants could reduce US peak coincident demand by 60 gigawatts. Additionally, these resources are rapid and can be flexibly deployed and can be built in as little as months and can be configured to meet distinct challenging grid needs. The next is affordability. So VPPs can support affordability by decreasing the entire electric system costs through avoiding different investments for potential peaker plants or avoiding that would otherwise be necessary. And customers can be compensated for contributions for participating in a virtual power plant. The next is decarbonization. Virtual power plants minimize the dispatch of highly polluting power plants to drive a greener power supply and can drive the build out of a carbon-free power supply by shifting demand that can reduce solar and wind curtailment to better utilize the carbon-free resources in your area. The next is electrification. So virtual power plants are able to shift demand to avoid bottlenecks in transmission and distribution or generation capacity, which would otherwise constrain electrification. Additionally, we have health inequity. So like we mentioned, the decrease in reliance on gas-fired peaker plants, which disproportionately impact people of health and low-income community health. So by relying less on those, then increasing the health inequity by having less emissions. And lastly, consumer empowerment. So consumers can play an active role in shaping the way energy used in their society. On the next slide, you can see a graphic from a bridal study that was published in May of this year that took a deeper look at the benefits by quantifying the value that VPPs can provide and resource adequacy specifically. The graph here shows the annualized net cost of providing 400 megawatts of resource adequacy for 3 resource adequacy alternatives. So including a natural gas peaker, a transmission connected utility scale battery, and a virtual power plant. The distributed nature of a virtual power plant allows them to provide a broader range of system benefits than transmission connected alternatives. And you can see in the different colors here that calls out the different benefits that can be provided. And just to highlight a couple, the energy section here refers to how VPPs can curtail loads during the highest cost hours of the day and shift the loads to lower hours. And the T&D and resiliency portion refers to how that reductions in demand will delay the need for peak related capacity upgrades, also lowering costs, and that behind the meter batteries can provide backup generations during distribution outages. You can see here just by the 3 comparisons that the VPP resources provide the same resource adequacy at a significant discount. Additionally, a sensitivity analysis was also done during this study, and it is the only resources, virtual power plants, with the potential to provide resource adequacy at a negative net cost to society in markets with potentially higher T&D costs or higher greenhouse gas emissions. The last thing to note here is, as we mentioned in the RMI analysis, that we estimated that there's 60 gigawatts of VPPs could be deployed nationally. At scale, that would result to be $15 to $35 billion in resource costs associated with the alternatives. So the opportunity here is sizable. On the next slide, we wanted to showcase that in addition to resource adequacy, the energy transition is altering demand for grid services, and VPPs provide additional necessary services that are already benefiting cooperatives today. First, we have renewable energy build out and thermal plant retirement. Thermal power plants are being shut and renewables are being expanded, and this is challenging the grid to be operated differently. Virtual power plants are supporting this transition because they can be automatically called upon to support ramping and provide capacity. For example, Great River Energy added 150 megawatts to the MISO capacity market in 2023, supporting fossil fuel retirement. Next, as mentioned previously, electrification is accelerating with the adoptions of EVs, heat pumps, and more. Demand management and transmission and distribution capacity and deferral is needed to manage this growth. An example is Holy Cross Energy has managed EVs, residential battery system, and other flexibility tariffs to harness DERs and accomplish their clean electricity goals. And we look forward to hearing from Brian shortly to elaborate on these systems. And lastly, we have extreme weather and resiliency. These pose a challenge to existing systems, and resiliency is needed to keep systems running and people safe. Microgrids are a way to support neighborhoods in the event of a grid outage or weather emergency, and NRECA is supporting the advancements of microgrids. For example, North Carolina Electric Membership Corps has a microgrid to support its 31-home subdivision, which is able to run for 36 hours in times of outages due to hurricanes or weather or other weather events. So these are all examples of ways that VPPs can help support cooperatives as the power system evolves. Lastly, on the next slide, to close, VPPs represent opportunities for collaboration and mutual wins across the cooperative community. We recognize that each cooperative is unique, and the VP opportunity can be customized to meet specific community needs. We highlighted some general opportunities and benefits here, including for distribution cooperatives to manage loads and decrease load altogether through shifting, shedding, and shaping, and also having the flexibility to match load to supply. Matching load to supply can also benefit generation and transmission cooperatives by having less renewables curtailment by shifting that demand, and as well having infrastructure relief. For consumers, the weather resiliency mentioned helps decrease outages and increase system safety, and they can participate directly in the system by contributing to demand response. And then the community as a whole can benefit from greenhouse gas reduction, as mentioned, through renewable adoption, avoiding peakers, and avoided infrastructure. And these greenhouse gas emissions are something that we'll touch on later because they directly are related to funding opportunities. And lower costs across the community for consumers because they can be compensated for participating, for G&Ts for avoiding infrastructure and new generation, and for distributions for lowering charges associated with lower peak demand. So this was an overview about the why behind VPPs for cooperatives and sharing some of the benefits that are available. But to expand upon this, we've invited 2 speakers today to speak directly about the how and share more in depth of their experiences with implementing VPPs. So I'll pass it back to Christine to introduce our speakers.
Yeah, thank you. We're very pleased to have Brian Hannigan, CEO of Holy Cross Energy, and Cyril Brunner, innovation and technology leader from Vermont Electric, share their stories with us. We'll start with Brian, and I'll share your slides for you.
Perfect. Thank you, Christine, and good morning or good afternoon, everybody. I'm Brian Hannigan. I'm president and CEO of Holy Cross Energy. We're a mainly distribution electric cooperative based about 2 hours west of Denver in beautiful western Colorado. You see here on the opening slide a picture of our beautiful Eagle Vale Valley, one of the 3 valleys that we serve. If we could move to the next slide. Just a little bit about Holy Cross. We are a fairly mid-size cooperative with 46,000 members, 60,000 metering points, about 265 megawatts peak demand during the winter months, and about 150 megawatts of peak demand during the summer months. At the end of last year, more than half of our power supply came from renewable and carbon-free electricity. We expect that target on the next slide, you'll see that target will move up to something on the order of 90+%. And that frames our thinking about distributed resources and virtual power plants. So we can get the next slide. Our board of directors adopted in 2019 a goal of providing 100% clean energy to our members by the end of the decade. That's 2 parts. One is 100% carbon-free power supply by 2030. And then to go carbon neutral or better across the entire enterprise by 2035. At Holy Cross, our vision is to lead the responsible transition to a clean energy future. And the word responsible is very, very important. It means that we will achieve all of our sustainability goals in a way that does not sacrifice the affordability, the safety, or the reliability of the services that our consumers and our member owners have come to expect. So we'll be investing in energy efficiency. We'll be developing wholesale power resources that are cleaner. We'll be investing and partnering for local clean energy resources. We'll be fostering the development and deployment of distributed energy resources, which collected together can be operated as virtual power plants. And then we'll be encouraging smart electrification of buildings, transportation, industrial, and commercial uses that can also participate in VPPs and help us balance the local distribution grid in a way that offers more reliability, more resilience, and lower cost than simply relying on the wholesale market to do so. Hit the next slide. So as I mentioned, we are 50%, actually 55% today as of last month. We have a number of new resources developing or under contract to be online by the end of this year. And when we complete those, we will have a portfolio that is 90 to 92% renewable with a lot of wind, a lot of solar, and some clean, firm resources from biomass, hydro, and other portfolio options. You see, we also are adopting solar plus storage. One of those 3 projects is already deployed at the Colorado Mountain College Spring Valley campus here in Glenwood Springs. That 4.5 megawatt, 15 megawatt hour solar plus storage is an AC coupled unit that is capable of providing the ramping services that we rely on gas turbines presently in our portfolio to do so. And we have 2 more of those projects coming on before the end of the year, one in Rifle and one in Parachute. Those are very important parts of the portfolio. And interestingly enough, operated collectively with DERs, they begin to form the basis of virtual power plants that, as I mentioned, can provide those grid services at times when the wind or the sun are not cranking at full output. Next slide. With a portfolio that is now 90 to 92% on an annual basis, you might appreciate that on some hours of some days, we'll actually be up over 100%. And this is our forecasted load shape for May 19th of next year, based on our expected demand, which is the line there in red, and the expected output using meteorological data from all of our resources on our system. And you can see from about the hours of 10 o'clock until maybe 8 or 9 in the evening, we'll be in an oversupply situation with a significant number of excess renewables on the order of anywhere from 30 to 50 megawatts at that point. Now, the easy way to deal with them is to connect to a wholesale market, sell into that wholesale market, and dispose of the excess. But we may also want to store that power for use later in the day or overnight. As you see, we have some net load remaining to serve in the overnight hours and in the evening ramp. We may also want to utilize distributed resources as flexible loads that could actually soak up and store that excess energy and avoid the need to actually demand it later on when we might have to go to the market or go to a fossil-fired resource to make up the difference. So we really see the value of distributed resources acting collectively as virtual power plants to help us with balancing that last 8 to 10% in a way that is cost-effective and reliable. Next slide. And this is just an example of how we see DERs playing that role. And as you see on the left, we view VPPs as simply coordinated sets of distributed energy resources that can be orchestrated in a way to provide the necessary grid services and the necessary energy supply or demand flexibility. For example, we can use smart thermostats to preheat or cool buildings. We can use variable charging rates and potentially V2G to charge EVs when the wind and solar is plentiful and to discharge them into the evening hours solar ramp so that we don't have to fire up new resources. We can also allow buildings to ride through the peak, basically preheat or pre-cool the structure to a level above the set point, and then let that set point coast gradually back towards the desired maximum without pulling from the grid in the later afternoons. This is actually some work that RMI has done that inspired us to figure out how to take that dotted line, which would be our net load shape with all the ramping and ancillary services needs, and use VPPs in effect to take it from that blue dotted line to that small green dotted line, which is a much more efficient use of the infrastructure. It avoids peak demand charges. It actually helps the system run more reliably because it's running at a much more stable set of voltages and frequency. And so it actually limits our operations and maintenance costs, which are a key element of the rates that we pass on to our members. So we look to DERs to provide that needed flexibility. And in many ways, that first 80% of our carbon journey, we could meet that with large chunks of clean energy and large investments. As we approach 100%, we are necessarily talking about smaller chunks of clean energy and demand flexibility, locationally specific on certain parts of our system. You move in a way from chainsaws to scalpels. And that's the value of VPPs, is that they can be as big or as little as you want them to be as you manage your resource portfolio. Next slide. So here's an example of one of our early programs. In 2021, we rolled out a Power Plus energy storage program, zero money down, 0% financing with a capacity payment for the right to use the battery as a way to encourage our residential and our commercial and industrial members to adopt behind the meter energy storage that both improve their energy resilience, but also allowed us to use the battery as a grid resource. The picture that you see here is an installation on one of our Holy Cross owned houses at our Glenwood Springs campus. And one of the neat things that we found out in this initial installation is that even though we provide really good power quality and we have reliability statistics in the top quartile of the nation, we began to see things on our system that we didn't even know were there. The install at this site avoided 12 interruptions and 290 outage minutes at this location on our campus at our headquarters in just the first quarter of installation alone. Never mind what you can see is a real value to the grid by storing in the overnight hours and dispatching into the afternoon peak, saving peak demand charges and conserving that precious renewable energy that we've already paid for and we can put to good use. Next slide. We also are looking at electric vehicles as a distributed energy resource that can be aggregated together into a virtual power plant. We provide free level 2 chargers to every residential or commercial member with a full $650 rebate, provided that we have the opportunity and the right to manage the charging rate should we need to for local reliability or for grid services purposes. We also allow our consumers to sign up for what's called a DER service agreement, because what we found was we gave folks a free charger, but they didn't have the $1,500 or so to get it installed by a local electrician. So we said, hey, why don't we take on that amount, allow the electrician to send the bill to us, and then provide for an on-bill financing mechanism for the member consumer to charge down that $1,500 or so expenditure over time with another line on their bill. We also are working with our communities to dedicate at least one fast charger in every community that we serve. We are 28 out of 30 at this point, with the last 2 planning to come on this year. We provide in-kind upgrades and engineering support, and we're working with all of our school districts and our transit agencies to support TOU rates without a demand charge to foster the uptake of those electric vehicles. Those buses are on average about 1 megawatt of load, so it's equivalent to a hotel or a small commercial building. And part of the value of having those on our grid is that when those buses are garaged, they're extremely capable elements of the VPP. If I could get the slides back up in the next slide. I'll speak to the next slide, which I believe it addresses our Basalt Vista affordable housing project. This was a project that we engaged in with our local Habitat for Humanity chapter in the town of Basalt, so near the RMI Innovation Center. It was a community that had been affected by wildfires and was very concerned about system resilience. This affordable housing project for teachers and local service economy workers was a 27-unit development, but 4 of those units were outfit by us with 8 kilowatts of solar, a battery inside the utility closet, a level 2 charger, a heat pump water heater, and an air source heat pump. All of those devices were individually metered and controlled, but over the course of the project that we partnered with NREL and the DOE Office of Electricity, we began to learn how to integrate all of those DERs together, first at the single premise and then later collectively across all 4 homes. So you had 20 DERs acting in concert as effectively a virtual power plant, always keeping the condition of the structure between the set points desired by the homeowner. So that means 68 to 72 interior temperature, battery charged at least 25%, vehicles always charged at least 25% and ready to go. But these DERs could be managed by us and influenced by us with both control signals and price signals. And this was an amazing opportunity for us to learn how distributed resources and buildings that are grid interactive could provide a lot of value, not only to the consumer, but also to the grid. Next slide. So we've taken all of this knowledge built up from the component level, from the DER level now into our first microgrid project. We have a 5 megawatt solar farm just on the south end of the Aspen Airport that is in the process of being paired with utility scale battery storage, but also distributed solar PV, electrification of the airside fleet support vehicles at the airport, battery storage at all of the critical infrastructures that you see here. Because in 2019, during the Lake Christine fire, where we nearly lost the transmission line that serves this area, we realized that without electric power, we wouldn't have critical services. We wouldn't have the transit authority, RFTA. We wouldn't have the water treatment plant, ACSD. We wouldn't have our substation and our office. They're located in the bottom right. We wouldn't be able to operate the airport to get people out or to get goods in. The local Pitkin County Service Center hosts the sheriff and the fire department. The animal shelter couldn't keep the animals safe. There were a number of cascading effects that were really going to be problematic. And so we decided that we would take both utility assets and DERs and turn them into effectively a microgrid that could provide energy resilience on the black sky days when the grid services from Holy Cross weren't available. But on the blue sky days, it could operate as a virtual power plant and potentially serve all or some of the electric load in that portion of the valley. So I hope these examples have given you some sense of how we're already using VPPs and the concepts behind them at Holy Cross to try to achieve both our sustainability goals, but also provide reliable and resilient energy and services to the members that we serve. I think that's the last slide. Oh, one word. It's not just the technologies, it's also the rate and program options. So everything from a DER service agreement that allows low interest on bill payments for DERs, very important for energy equity. Typically, DERs are an upfront payment that primarily serves middle and upper income folks who have the discretionary funds. But to make sure that everyone can access DERs, we feel it's very important to use the utility balance sheet to ensure that upfront barrier is not truly a barrier to adoption. We have peak time demand response programs. We have a inverse of that where we actually call it green up. So in times of oversupply, we actually call for more consumption and pay for that. And so the inverse to a normal event-based demand response. We've got a distribution flexibility credit where basically we're buying the capacity option from a DER from our members, and it's an additional source of revenue to help offset the cost of that DER. And then, of course, time of use and increasingly dynamic pricing provide great opportunities to monetize the DER at the point of sale. I think that's the last slide. We laugh. So I'm going to leave with a provocative construct. Right now, our conventional rate designs are typically 2-part or 3-part rates. We have a membership fee or a fixed charge. We have a peak demand charge in some cases, or a demand charge overall, and an energy charge. In the future, as our member consumers are more participatory and they're producing and consuming, we are not going to be able to rely on the energy charge and on commodity sales of kilowatt hours from the utility to the consumer to provide all of the resources that we need to maintain the grid, the delivery system. Consumers are going to have the opportunity to produce and consume their energy. And frankly, in some cases, they're probably going to do that as a preferential option and really only rely on the grid for backup services. And so one of the things that we've tried to start a conversation around here in Colorado is, what does a future rate design need to be in order to foster virtual power plants, microgrids, self-generation, things like community choice, which we see in other states. And our concept right now, and it's receiving a lot of good and bad comment, would be to separate out all of the charges to operate the electric grid and to maintain it into a per kilowatt hour delivery charge that appears on the bill separate and distinct from the energy itself. And that allows us to be agnostic as to whether someone produces their own energy, buys it from a third party, or buys it from us. As long as it's delivered and that fee for delivery is being paid, we have the resources that we need to maintain the grid. In many ways, this is like an open access distribution tariff. Those of you familiar with transmission are well aware of the OAT concept for transmission tariffs. We would look at maybe extending that down into the distribution level. There's a lot of controversy associated with it. It obviously impacts the value of DERs, but it also potentially creates a happy harmony with all the folks involved in trying to maintain the grid and keep the lights on, as well as to provide power and services to one another. So I'll leave you with that as a thought process. In my mind, this will be increasingly a barrier to DER and VPP deployment unless we come up with a solution. And we look forward to working with the VPP community to have that conversation in a way that sustains everybody and gets us to where we want to go from a clean energy future perspective. Now it's the last slide. For more information, follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Check us out at our website. You can find more information about all of our stuff there. Thanks for the extra time.
Thanks, Brian. Love hearing about Holy Cross Energy. And I think you'll be in one of our breakouts, so people can ask more questions. But I also wanted to mention that please put your questions in the chat window so that we can either try to answer them during the session or come back to you after talking to Brian and Cyril and any of the other speakers to get questions answered. With that, thank you, Brian, and Cyril, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. And thanks, Brian, for sharing all that stuff. I know we're eagerly paying attention to what you're doing on the rate design side of things. Some pretty neat stuff. So Brian did a tremendous job talking about the power supply impacts. I'm going to talk a little bit more on the infrastructure side of things and also talk a little bit about our programs as well. So VC's 33,000 members, so a little smaller than Holy Cross. We also have renewable and an ambitious target to be 100% renewable by 2030. Lots of heat pumps on our system, around 10% of our membership, 3,000 plus. And Vermont's continuing to kind of push the envelope as it relates to EV sales. So exciting times here in New England and definitely a lot of opportunities. So we can go to the next slide. Just to give a quick overview of where the heck we are and where Vermont is for folks who aren't aware, we're kind of in the northern part of New England, close to the Canadian border. Vermont is the only state without a McDonald's at its state capital. And in addition to that being fun, we also have, there is no G&T in Vermont. So actually all the Vermont distribution utilities have ownership over the transmission operator, Velco. So I often refer to VC as much more of a G&D with some transmission components. So just structurally, we're also regulated and always feel like that's interesting to share. There's so many different co-op models around the country. So maybe next slide. So what kind of growth are we seeing? We're seeing a ton of distributed generation growth, 7th per capita in the US for solar growth. It's pretty cloudy here, which is often interesting, but the incentives are quite high. And as you can tell here, we do have several substations with a reverse flow. We have spring and fall peak midday loads around 34 megawatts. So dropping that kind of like peak midday load, obviously, with the amount of generation that's coming online. And I would say the vast majority of that generation is rooftop solar. We do have some larger solar sites, a little bit of wind, but a lot of rooftop going in currently. Next slide. Transportation and heating. As I mentioned, quite a few heat pumps being installed. We are starting to see a doubling of electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids on an annual basis. And really for us, in addition to all the things that Brian mentioned, the infrastructure impacts are very significant on this additional load. So we're projecting 2040 loads increases around 90 megawatts without any management of DER devices. Now, our hope is that we can manage 75 to 90% of electric vehicles. We're unsure on the heat pump end of things. That's a space we're trying to explore, but you can see here that we're hopeful that we can navigate and cut that down almost in half if we can manage these devices accordingly. Now we're still going to have to upgrade some distribution transformers and lines and substations, but hopefully a significantly less amount than us just trying for behavioral rate structures. We truly believe that the direct DER management is the way to go and the way to mitigate those constraints on the system. Next slide. So just to kind of talk through the flexible load programs and pilots that we have, there's definitely some overlap with what Brian shared and what Holy Cross is doing. We also have a free level 2 charger program. Again, we give that away with the caveat that folks allow us to manage that device directly. Of the 450 EVs on the system, around 100 are actively managed. That program's been slowly growing. We also do a free distribution transformer upgrade, very similar to what Brian mentioned. We are finding that, folks were real excited about getting an electric vehicle coming home and then realizing that they, also had to upgrade their distribution transformer. Our program is based around bill credits. We do an $8 a month bill credit for participation in that charge management program, and that's been well received. We've had less than 10 opt-outs since the program began in 2019. So generally, as long as those electric vehicles are charged in the morning when they leave, folks honestly don't even notice the program is happening, which is kind of how we've designed it. We are exploring a telematics pilot. I mentioned, we're only actively managing around 100 of the 450. The big gap there is Tesla vehicles, which, as I'm sure many of the utilities on the call will attest to, Tesla can be a challenge to work with in that space. And so we're hopeful to kind of leverage the telematics pilot to mitigate some of that. Moving on to the battery programs, we have bring your own programs. So we don't lease out any batteries, but we do have programs that allow folks who have purchased batteries to receive, a $6.40 per month bill credit. And that works with Tesla, Sonnen, and Generac batteries. We typically dispatch these resources around 40 hours per month, 4 to 6 times on average. Vermont and VC, we have 12 Vermont peak and one ISO New England peak that basically dictates our transmission charges that we can get direct savings from. So those are the peaks that we try and target. And we also monitor the weather in advance of that dispatch. That's a big challenge. Typically, these peak days happen to be days where there's also storms, whether those are winter storms or summertime thunderstorms. We have a Beat the Peak program, which is around 400 members are enrolled into that. There's no monetary incentive, but we do communicate to these folks who have signed up for the program 3 to 4 times annually for that, ISO New England peak that we see. And that's actually been fairly successful. It's like very low lift from us. It's just an email to ask folks to reduce the amount of energy usage they're seeing. And that's been effective. It's probably only in the 100 to 200 kilowatt range, but every little piece helps us with that flexibility in what we're doing. We're currently working through a pilot and a program with dynamic organics for building management. It's very similar to what Brian talked about as it relates to shifting load around within buildings and pre-cooling and preheating. This project is focused on a ski area, a hotel, and an ice rink. We're expecting around 250 to 300 kilowatts of reduction for a $4 to $5 a month per kilowatt bill credit. And so far, it's been really well received. Ultimately, the goal there, again, just like most of these, is limited to no member impact and hopefully some value in the end. As it relates to heat pumps and solar in general, it's a space we're trying to explore. The heat pump space is incredibly challenging right now, as these devices are just incredibly efficient, which is great. But they don't really offer a ton of demand flexibility that we've seen, and they also don't have great communications built in, unlike the electric vehicles and the batteries. So that's a space that we're definitely trying to explore and trying to navigate through. So we can go on to the next slide. Building blocks for a successful program, some really key kind of pieces. I'll start with the kind of ground base, which is affordable. We try and target a 6-year ROI. Typically, the lower that is, the better. And a big part of that today is peak value projection. And what exactly those peak costs look like. That is the driver of these programs from an economic standpoint today. The hope is that, we can utilize things like infrastructure deferral in the future as a value point, but today they're very peak management based. We obviously want to limit the amount of action and impact to members' lives. That's why we like these direct management programs. Folks don't have to remember to plug in their electric vehicle or go and unplug it during certain times of the day. We just found that, most folks are happy to just kind of leave that as is. And as long as that vehicle is charged in the morning, they're happy. We want to make sure they're effective. I would say one of the struggles we've had is just device uptime and managing member Wi-Fi and those sorts of connections. That can be a challenge administratively to do that. We found some good strategies of how to mitigate that. And then certainly first and foremost, it's got to be simple, right? What we found is anytime we have to go into a home and install an additional device and there isn't some sort of built-in API for that device, we end up typically having a much lower enrollment. And that device enrollment process needs to be simple and easy. We don't want folks having to go make a bunch of changes on the back end and update, passwords and these sorts of things. So lots of learnings, early days in a lot of our programs, but definitely seeing some real value. We can go on to the next slide. A little bit higher level here for a second. I just wanted to kind of articulate that, one of the things that's really key to all of this working is the technology and is the data on the system. I touched here on our programs for member assets in particular. We're leveraging a DERMS system to manage a lot of that. We obviously have our existing utility owned assets, which we manage through SCADA. And what's really critical is to have an understanding of what the grid is doing. Our goal is to very much utilize a single platform to both identify the constraints that are happening infrastructure wise and also dispatch assets to hopefully eliminate and in most cases defer infrastructure upgrades. We know that, there's just not enough time with this load growth to be upgrading lines and substation transformers. And if we can manage these devices, our goal is to very much hopefully avoid a lot of that work. But what's critical is definitely the AMI system and the static data. And hopefully we can leverage that to enable our staff to get a better sense of what's going on and also develop more programs as we move through that. Next slide. Just a quick slide here on challenges and opportunities. I think I mentioned this. We definitely, one of the biggest struggles we have is, per OEM device integrations. The more OEMs that are out there, and I'll give a good example right now of, in particular, the various OEMs all putting out their own chargers. There's definitely a problem. We have charge point of flow that we're integrated with today, which is working great. As OEMs begin offering out free level 2 chargers with each vehicle, that becomes harder for us to manage. No one's going to want a free charger if they already have one at the dealership. Low device quantities, so longer ROI. We've definitely found that we've had to look at our staff and make sure that they're getting much more exposure to the other aspects of the business. Traditionally, utilities have been super siloed. We found that in order to make these programs work, there needs to be an understanding kind of cross company, and that's a space that we're exploring. Trusting vendors and the longevity of those vendors is a challenge. There's so many dollars going into this space. It's a wonderful opportunity and lots of great work happening, but how can we make sure that the partnerships we're working with aren't just going to last a couple of years and are going to kind of work in the long run? And then, of course, cybersecurity. As I mentioned, most of these devices are reliant on customer Wi-Fi, member Wi-Fi. And, that's an unsecure system. It gives our operations technology and cyber folks headaches, of course. How can we limit our exposure of the secure systems with this insecure piece, but still gain the value? And then opportunities, for me and VC, in addition to the power supply and peak shaving impacts, this deference and hopefully elimination of infrastructure upgrades is really critical. These programs, I think, are really going to offer us a lot of benefit in that space. Aggregators, telematics is a great example, help that per OEM device integration. And hopefully enable us to talk to more devices and not have a lot of headaches when it comes to APIs and software integration. We're really excited about these partnerships with members. I think Brian and Holy Cross have touched on some really, really great programs that they've been working on, and it's really exciting to be able to work with members instead of just giving them a bill every month. That's been a really great piece for us. Of course, the peak reduction plays a role. And partnerships with utilities and vendors are incredibly exciting for us. We're focused on how we manage the electric system and how we do that. We're not software experts. We are not experts in coding and those sorts of things. And so we're really eager to find partners and vendors who kind of expand what we can do and allow us to do more. So I don't have a last slide on my contact info, but certainly, like Brian mentioned, very much available, and shoot me a message on LinkedIn or email or whatever. If you have additional things, happy to answer anything and share what we're doing.
Thank you, Cyril. I am going to be switching a little bit around here, and there's one question that I wanted to elevate and just let you or Brian answer. And it was a question about regards to future rate design changes and how would you manage granularity with customer understanding and complexity? If one of you, maybe Brian, you can start.
Yeah, we'll start, because that's exactly the trade-off that the Holy Cross Energy Board has been working on and working with over the last couple of years. It's a kind of a standard bond-right rate principle that we want bills to be easy to understand, but we also want them to be cost reflective. And so you've seen lots of cost allocation, and we have our own in-house cost of service model that we developed in partnership with the Brattle Group a couple of years ago. And we could atomize every expenditure to kingdom come and make it super complex. But really what we did in the last slide that I showed with those 5 boxes is we took the major categories of our expenditures and allocated them to our member customers in a way that we thought was fair and equitable in the opinion of the board, and socialized with rate experts and so on, so that in theory, we can draw a direct line from our annual budgets and our Form 7 financial data and the lines on that through to how, with a formula rate, we allocate those costs so that we can recover them equally and fairly from our members. And I think this simplicity is super important, because our members are going to come to the world of DERs and VPPs in very different frames. Some of them will be those early adopters that want to manage everything on their own with 15 apps, and they want to be their local balancing authority, and God bless them for taking that on. And we want to offer them with some options that allow them to do that. Others are what I'll call set it and forget it. They'll want to work with a third party, or they'll want to program it themselves one time and let the devices do the management in between the defined set points of what the consumer preferences are. Others may want us to manage it and be willing to just get paid for the right to use the consumer's own resource as effectively a grid resource. And they might see this as their way of helping run the electric grid that they own and they get benefits from. And there are going to be a lot of consumers that say, you know what, I just want the lights on and I want a simple rate and I don't want any of this mumbo jumbo, and leave me out of it. And we have to have a variety of rate offerings that appeal to those classes of folks. And frankly, are simple enough to explain when we're out there in the community, we're at our annual meeting, when they come in and ask questions. So I think our preference is to err on the side of simplicity rather than true cost reflectivity. We're looking at entering a wholesale market, the SPP here in the West. Once it becomes effective, we're already in the energy imbalance service through our wholesale provider, Public Service of Colorado. And being able to transmit through those prices, those locational marginal prices is good, but not everybody's going to want to have that full amount of market exposure. And so we, I think, need to have, again, a variety of rate options that are simple, that are clear, where consumers can make those choices themselves, and then they'll be more likely to stick with the choices that they've made.
Thanks. Sarah, do you have anything from Vermont?
I think Brian nailed it. I mean, I
Okay,
think that's about as comprehensive of an answer as you'll get. So I'm going to leave it to him.
great. I think I'm going to move us on to the next part of our presentations. We can come back to Q&A after this portion, and also continue in breakouts. With that, I will turn it over to RMIers Michael Liebman and Zach Clayton to present on federal funding opportunities.
Thanks, Christine. Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Liebman. I'm a manager on RMI's carbon-free electricity team, and really excited to chat about this topic for a number of reasons, including the one that Kevin mentioned earlier around LMI benefits. So I was at a conference that NRECA hosted last week with financing and accounting professionals from co-ops. And one of the really big things that emerged for me was how important these folks are in their communities, where they're often serving folks from lower middle income communities. So really looking forward to diving into this topic, and I really enjoyed this work as we think about how we as RMI can help folks in these communities adopt renewable energy. And just before I jump in, we'll quickly say there were a number of different partners at this conference that we were able to learn from, including co-ops, financial institutions like CFC and CoBank, the USDA, NRECA, and then also our partners, including Clean Energy Works. So just wanted to say, really appreciate all the folks that took time to chat with us last week, because we definitely were able to include some of those learnings in this presentation. Next slide, please. So the Inflation Reduction Act has received a lot of attention around what it can do for renewable energy, and it's super exciting, and that attention is well-deserved. It hasn't received as much attention about how it can help balance sheets, but this is the key part of the story that we think is super important to tell. So with different IRA programs, co-ops can potentially add assets to their balance sheet and get 50 to 70% of those costs covered by a combination of tax credits and grants. So we think this will be really great for co-ops who may want to strengthen the position of their balance sheet. This will really help them do that. And now we have a number of opportunities listed here, just because we know there are a lot of opportunities to navigate. And we're going to be focusing in this presentation on two specific programs. One is elective pay, which used to be called direct pay. That is from the Department of Treasury. And then the other is the New Era program coming from the USDA. All these other programs are definitely important, but we're going to walk through why we're focused on these two in some forthcoming slides. Next slide, please. Thanks. So first, before we dive in, we're not the federal government, and they should be considered the final source of information for these programs. We've reviewed the guidance. Both the USDA and the Treasury are continuing to post clarifications. Treasury is continuing to receive comments, and this information is up to date as of yesterday. Next slide, please. So why are we focusing on these opportunities? So we think that New Era and Elective Pay are going to be best positioned. And first, next bullet, please. These are large opportunities. So the New Era program is a $9.7 billion program for both grants and loans for co-ops to deploy renewable energy. And then Elective Pay has no cap currently set. So these are really large programs where the potential output for y'all doing, a letter of intent and an application is great. Next bullet, please. The timing is also important. So some of y'all may have applied to PACE, for example, and that has a rolling timeline. New Era has a September 15th cutoff, which means if you put your application in on the 1st or the 7th, doesn't matter, it still gets evaluated at the same time. And the tax credits are taken when claimed. And then the last two bullets, if you can also put the next one on, please, Christine. So the grant from New Era can support future debt, and per the USDA, same thing with the tax credits coming from Elective Pay. But we would encourage folks to continue to follow the Treasury guidance that is continuing to be updated. As I said earlier, they're continuing to take comments. Next slide, please. So with New Era, VPPs are specifically called out, which is a really great piece of progress. Before, the technologies that were specifically called out were technologies that folks were more, familiar with. So solar, storage, wind, but now VPPs have been specifically called out as eligible for New Era. With that progress, we realized that some of y'all may really wish that someone else could own, and this is an important topic to address. So the recent Q&A document that came out of the USDA specifically says that the utility has to own the equipment. So a good comparison here would be when telecom was much younger than it is now. If you were to turn over a phone in someone's house, it might say property of Bell Electric. And this is actually something that I heard from a USDA staffer last week. This is how USDA is doing this, that the utility will need to own the equipment for it to be eligible to receive New Era funding. So great to see that they're specifically including it, but we understand that ownership element may be a challenge for some folks. And we're in the process of working with partners to see if there's a possibility that a PPA for a VPP could be included. One thing I want to note here in terms of the grant is that the grant can cover 25% of the project cost. And then the loan can come either from RUS, from the Rural Utility Service from USDA, or it can also come from another financial institution. So for example, CFC or CoBank could also provide that loan. And USDA has stated that they're okay either way. If folks want to go out and work with a CFC or a CoBank rather than getting the loan from USDA, that's fine. Next bullet, please. One other important item to note around these letters of intent, that's the first step on this process, is that these are non-binding. So this means that internally, there may be a more streamlined process in terms of putting in a letter of intent. The application is going to be binding, but these letters of intent that are due on September 15th are non-binding. So hopefully it means it's an easier process for folks to submit this letter of intent. Maybe they can engage with certain stakeholders later if they're invited to submit an application after that letter of intent goes in. Next slide, please. So we wanted to go through the different categories, and there are 3 different categories that are divided based on plant size, under 200 million, 200 to 500 million, and then over 500 million. It's important to note that cooperatives can partner up if they would like to. But let's say that we have a co-op that has $100 million of plant partnering up with another co-op that has $150 million of plant. They will then move into the second, that middle category, which will likely be more competitive than the other category. So this is something that co-ops should weigh as they're thinking about partnership is, okay, what are the benefits from this partnership versus what are going to be the challenges in terms of moving into a group that may be a bit more competitive. Next slide. We wanted to review the ownership transfer as we realized that this is something that folks are likely thinking about. And first, because the new era involves a grant, the co-op could purchase, VPP assets that are eligible using this new era funding. Then they could file for and receive, assuming that everything is in order in terms of their project, receive the elective credit payment. After that, members can be making payments on the assets on their bill. The co-op will need to own the asset for the useful life. Then after that, the co-op could transition that asset over to the member owner. So wanted to kind of give this overview just because we know folks are thinking about, okay, well, how is this going to play with the valuable relationship that we have with our member owners? Next slide, please. So this last slide shows how letters of intent are being evaluated. And important to note on this opportunity that what USDA is looking at is they're looking at the emissions reduction per dollar. And they have a tool that's called the ART tool that they've released on their website that will be used to calculate emissions reduction. And we'd encourage folks to be thinking about a VPP as part of a broader application. So it could include other renewables like solar, wind, storage, and thinking about how this VPP can help shift demand from, maybe a fossil fuel peaker plant to those renewables that could be included in the application. And really having the VPP enable the most benefit from the renewables. We know per Mary's slides earlier that a VPP has a lot of advantages, but for this opportunity, they're looking at specifically emissions reduction. So with that, I'll hand over to Zach.
Thanks, Michael. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you. I work with Michael on this utility transition finance team within the electricity program at RMI. So Michael's talked about one opportunity, the new ERA program. I'm going to talk about the second opportunity, elective pay tax credits. This is a watershed moment right now. Previously, tax exempt organizations, like many of you on the call today, may not have been able to claim tax credits because they didn't have tax liability. Now it's changed so that you can, and this means you get many benefits. One is that previously you may have needed to work with a third party who could claim those tax credits, which created more complexity in the process. Maybe they took a bit of a chunk of the pie for that process. And now none of that is a problem anymore. Plus you get all the benefits you can pass on to your members and to your balance sheets. So let's keep this in mind. This is a huge change. Next slide, please, Christine. The investment tax credit, which is one of the options we'll discuss today, could cover 30% to 70% of a project's cost. And the production tax credit is substantial too. Next, please. It's the investment tax credit. If you click the next slide, Christine, we can see how you get up to 70%. There's a 30% base, which you could use for both rooftop solar, thinking about VPP technologies, or for storage like batteries. You get 10% additional if you use domestic content, 10% if it's located in a defined energy community, and an additional 10% for two other areas as well. Something to keep in mind for the low income tracts and the federally subsidized housing is those solar projects must be under 5 megawatts in order to achieve those benefits. If you click the next, Christine, we can see how storage is part of this, but there is one thing to keep in mind. You will be constructing the project and need to pay for it, and then you'll be claiming the tax credit. And there's a period of time in there where you'll need to have some potential bridge financing. We'll bring up this more later, but that could be where a new ERA grant might be able to come in for the project or a loan. Next, please. The production tax credit is another option you might consider, particularly if you have good solar resources because as you're generating solar energy over time, you're getting a tax credit for that. And that occurs as a more long duration through the course of 10 years, as we see here. It's inflation adjusted. Next, please. One thing to keep in mind is that you'll need to meet domestic content requirements. So start soon in order to achieve the full potential here. As you can see, the manufactured product domestic content requirement increases through 2027, and your benefit will decrease down to a measly 0%. So start soon. Of course, you don't need to start operating soon, as we see in the bottom, but you do need to start construction soon to get this full benefit. Next, please. Tax credits can fund many VPP technologies. Here's a slide we saw Mary present previously. We see how the production tax credit, the investment tax credit I've discussed, apply to rooftop solar, apply to storage. There's also 2 more tax credits, which, albeit smaller, are also interesting. And those fall into electric vehicle infrastructure for charging and for commercial clean vehicles as well. Next, please. Last but not least, let's put everything together here. So these are 4 different technologies we've heard. There's a distributed energy resource management system, or DERMS, which can act as the brains of the system. You may be owning many VPP assets, but you probably don't want to be individually thinking about 1,000 rooftop solar panels, 1,000 electric vehicle charging stations. The brains of the system, the DERMS, can help do all that for you. And that is eligible within the New Era funding because it helps facilitate the adoption of these renewable energy assets. Behind the meter storage with or without solar is also available in New Era, demand flexibility, and manage EV charging. Quick to note that, in fact, virtual power plants were not originally part of the New Era guidance for eligibility earlier this year, but thanks to some tireless work from several folks, have been included. So now you have an option to, in addition to the different renewable assets you might be thinking about at the utility scale, also bring a virtual power plant to your New Era application. Then, as I mentioned, the elective pay tax credits can help with rooftop solar, storage, electric vehicles, and you can even combine these 2 opportunities because, as Michael mentioned, the tax credits can fulfill that equity portion if you're needing to take out a New Era loan. So that's a great combination as well. Last slide for me. So 3 takeaways. Definitely apply by New Era by September 15th for VPPs and more projects. It's a short letter of intent, a 3-page project description and discussing your ambition, and then a completed emission reduction model provided by USDA, as Michael mentioned. Tax credits can also help fund VPPs and can cover the majority of a project's cost. That's huge. And last but not least, please reach out to us if you discuss more financing strategies in detail.